Majority Report with Sam Seder. It's time to look in the mirror, America. Do you like what you see?
I keep referring to Obama as the magic Negro.
Do you like what you see now?
Well, suck on this.
It's just a mirror, America.
Shared sacrifice by everybody.
What could it do to you except reflect your image?
I did nothing wrong at the Minneapolis airport.
The Majority Report.
Far more credible to me than PBS and Frontline.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, August 17th, 2017. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday, and this is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Eva Golinger, attorney, activist, author of The Chavez Code. We're going to talk about what's happening in Venezuela now, the many sides of that conflict, the role that the U.S. is playing, upcoming election there, and why there's really no good side at the moment in Venezuela. We'll also get back to some of the history and the accomplishments of Chavismo as well as its failures, all that with Eva Golinger. Donald Trump has always been, is now, and will remain a cheddar-brained, virulent racist. And he went out on another Twitter tantrum after he disbanded his council of advisors before they could all quit. Dangerous and disturbing times. Steve Bannon reached out to a liberal writer at the American Prospect and gave what apparently he did not think was an interview, but a interview nonetheless. He was speaking on the record. He didn't specify otherwise, which is unfair. And if this interview does not get Steve Bannon fired, it means that Steve Bannon has a P-tape himself of Donald Trump. He is literally in possession of that DVD. There was a recent, just as we were starting, apparently some sort of terrorist attack in Barcelona. A van rammed into several civilians. This literally just happened as we started. We might know more as the show goes on. Fallout continues. Donald Trump's robust racism. And we have video of Republican commentator Star Parker comparing the rainbow flag for the rights of LGBTQ community to the Confederate flag. And Jeff Sessions says that sanctuary cities are the friend of human traffickers. John Bolton has a meltdown on North Korea. Why? Well, you guessed it. Some members of this demented administration are actually advocating a rational course of action, including, ironically, Steve Bannon. That was part of what will get him fired, is because in this conversation with Robert Kuttner, he actually said some things about North Korea which were pretty sensible, including there is no military solution there.
What was he thinking?
What was he thinking?
That's not
totally unfair.
That's not what MacArthur would say, Steve.
Steve, I thought you understood MacArthur. Out of the gate, I do want to thank everybody. I think this is the second show I've hosted since the launch of the Michael Brooks Show. Thank you, everybody who's checked it out. 541 patrons. If we reach 700 by the end of August, we get a matching donation, which would be amazing and very helpful. So if we can get up to 700, that would be incredible. The first idea primer for members came out last week. That was on a modern history of the Third Way. This Sunday, me and Gene Bajlan, who's a Middle East scholar, did a primer on Turkey's Twitter army and Erdogan's use of social media and suppression and the sort of new right neo-authoritarian strategy of social media, which you see everywhere from Trump to Modi in India. Last week on the public show, had on Jabari Brisport, who's a socialist candidate running for city council in Matt and I's district in Brooklyn. 69 reviews on iTunes. A lot of people watching on YouTube. If you're a member or you're watching on iTunes, please subscribe to it on iTunes as well, because we want to get in front of more and more eyeballs. And this week, Anoa Changa and Sam Sachs from District Sentinel and Studio, the Michael Brooks Show. Thanks, everybody. We're refining it. There's going to be more sketches, more clips, working out the format, but really excited about it. Super producer Matt.
People should check out the Jabari Brisport interview. We're eventually going to clip it for the Majority Report YouTube page, but you should go check it out on the podcast because he was a very impressive candidate.
Yes.
I made the joke to Michael, like the centrists are going to be really pissed that they didn't get to him first, because he's very polished. We played a clip of him on Fox News, basically sort of pointing out how ludicrous the equivalence between Antifa and fascism is. It was a very impressive interview. I enjoyed it.
Young people putting their bodies on the line to fight Nazis are somehow equivalent to Nazis, only in the minds of Nazis, Fox News analysts, and deluded moronic centrists. Before we're going to get to This Morning in Tweets, which is a new segment that we're actually going to be doing regularly on the new show, or This Week in Tweets, unless, pray to God, this lunatic quits, which I doubt, but Jeffrey Schwartz has suggested he might. Or is it Jeffrey Schwartz? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. Schwartz, Tony Schwartz.
Ghostwriter.
His ghostwriter on Art of the Deal. But first I want to tell you about Breather. Sam had the opportunity to go check out the local Breather space, but it's an amazing concept. Every time you book a meeting or work event, there's a whole set of potential problems to consider. Where's the most convenient location? Will it feel professional? Will there be good Wi-Fi? Breather has a beautiful, inspiring workspaces for all of your offsite team meetings, client meetings, or even individual work. The best part, and this really is a crucial distinction in this whole kind of co-working space, you only pay for the time you need, a month, a day, or even just an hour. So anywhere where they have a location, which I'll get to in a moment, you can use this like that. Whether you want to do a writing session, therapists can use it, meetings, find a place to record something, all that stuff. It's incredible. There are no minimums or commitments with Breather. They own all their own spaces, so you get an excellent, consistent experience every time. Breather is in L.A., New York, San Francisco, Palo Alto, Boston, Chicago, D.C., Toronto, Montreal, London, and they're growing. Even Google, Apple, and Facebook employees use Breather for their offsites and team meetings, and they already have really nice offices. Don't overpay for your space you don't need. Book Breather space for the time you need it, and spend hundreds, not thousands. Try Breather right now, and you'll receive $100 off your first booking when you go to breather.com/majority. That's $100 off your first booking when you go to breather.com/majority. 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 Matt, at some point on the show, put a link on the blog post. I realized I neglected that. I'm sorry. So Donald Trump, when the events in Charlotte, Nazis rallied. There was a counter demonstration. A Nazi rammed his car into a group of people, killing one, injuring over 30 others. Donald Trump initially said there were violence on many sides. Then the following day, he must have been dressed down by one of his babysitters, and he sort of finally, in this very strained way, condemned the haters, Klan, and neo-Nazis. Then the next day, when we played it yesterday, had a full meltdown, said there were good people on all sides, and called out the alt-left for being violent, and then said, where does it end? Washington owned slaves. Jefferson owned slaves. And here he is in tweets from this morning. This is just an hour ago. I mean, he's really... This might even be before his first KFC snack of the day. He is having an absolute meltdown. And does it start? Yeah, okay, it starts in the bottom. Sad to see the history and culture of our country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. These are monuments and statues to Confederate terrorists who opposed, in fact, the creation of the modern version of this country, worth noting, and fought a battle on behalf of slavery. And by the way, like, let's be really clear. There isn't a sort of cute, there's complexity to the Civil War, obviously. But make no mistake, the kind of general popular understanding that slavery was a core issue and what they were fighting about was in fact the case. Not from like a northern human rights perspective. Obviously, northern states still, extraordinary levels of racism and white supremacy. But it was an economic battle, and the South's economy was built on just on human bondage. I mean, people really need to think about that. There's nothing antiseptic about this. Systemic rape, murder, torture, and enforced labor. Every grotesque thing you can imagine. Sad to see the history and culture of our country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You, and this is the next one, can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington, Jefferson. So foolish. Now, I said on my show that particularly Jefferson, is hard to historicize. He was, even by the standards of his day, a truly obscene guy. So even as an example, I mean, it sounds weird to say, and none of it's exculpatory, but Washington freed his slaves. How big of him when he passed away. Jefferson, when he passed away, made sure they were sold. Being that as it may, I mean, Sam pointed this out. Statues are also not sort of literal representations of individuals. It's also about what they represent.
They weren't put up by historians.
Right. And Washington represents the founding of this country, not a southern slave state. And Jefferson also wrote, in spite of his, hideous behavior and beliefs, obviously wrote movingly, a logic of universal human rights, which could be turned against him because they apply to all humans. That's what we're honoring. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were fighting again against the creation of the modern United States and for the preservation of slavery or states' rights. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never be able to be comparably replaced. Well, I, for one, sure hope they're not comparably replaced. It's always been obvious, first and foremost for Donald Trump, is his various emotional and mental issues and problems and resentments and narcissism and tantrums and sociopathy and stupidity and greed and scam artistry. But if he does have a consistent instinct towards anything, going back to his father and him, screening out tenants, to mind-bogglingly stupid comments he made in the 80s about who he wanted, about wanting Jews to handle his money, about how being an educated black would be a big advantage.
Central Park 5?
Central Park 5. He said, with regards to what happened in Charlottesville with white supremacist alt-right Nazi terrorism, that he watched it more closely than the press and he needed to get all the facts. Whereas in the 80s, he took out a front-page ad calling for the death penalty, reinstatement of the death penalty, to kill some teenagers of color who have all been exonerated, even though they had their lives ruined, because he was part of the racist mob that blamed them for that horrific attack in Central Park in the late 80s. To the extent there's anything that's consistent besides his bloviating stupidity and narcissism, it's his bigotry. And by the way, standing by it is not Mitch McConnell saying there's no such thing as good Nazis. Standing by it is anybody in Congress not saying we need to evoke 25th Amendment or get this guy out of office immediately or demanding he resign. If you're not doing that, you're complicit in it. We'll be right back with Ava Golinger on the Majority Report.
Now in comes the musical team from the kingdom. Jesse. Some people
and them still choose to show you hate. Sure. Run them out of your yard. From them I play bad young. I them a backbiters. Hypocritical to sideless. We call them modern day Judas. The spreaders of rumors. Oh, them a backbiters. Hypocritical to sideless. We call them modern day Judas. Spreaders of rumors. Hey, hey, so why should I be afraid of you when you bleed just like I do? The more you try fight, judge a light keeps shining through. So I've got no time for you, cause in my view you wanna step in on my shoe. You wish you never leave a loo and feel so damn confused. How every day you wake you ache because you know you're fake, and every step you take I bring you closer to your grave. But I am like a column when I easily shake. Me certain say I feel me none of who no can't take. We guided by the monster, defender of the faith. Yes, ordained to be great. Oh, them a backbiters, hypocritical to sideless. We call them modern day Judas, the spreaders of rumors. Oh, them a backbiters, hypocritical to sideless. We call them modern day Judas, spreaders of rumors. But your teeth and tongue gonna let you down. Reward for your words shall be profound. Oh, screw all you want, but go loo and drown.
Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Ava Golinger. She's an attorney, activist, and award-winning author of The Chavez Code. Ava, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So you have a really kind of long experience and background in Venezuela. We're going to talk about the crisis that Venezuela is in today and the sort of many different factors contributing to it. But I think that, you know, Chavez and Chavismo has kind of become, and this could just reflect my own biases, I think, and I'll sort of lay them out really briefly. I think that there was real accomplishments, real failures. It might not have been a project that was durable, but it's become a shorthand for some people that want to ignore U.S. behavior that continues in Latin America, and also a stand-in for why you can never have a real kind of left politics that redistributes wealth and handles resources fairly. And then on the other hand, there's a contingent of people that, you know, want to blame essentially the United States for for sort of every failing that has sometimes been totally self-generated in this project. You worked with Chavez. You had experience kind of going back to the beginning when he first came into power. And I just would like if you could reorient us to him and the initial project beyond these kind of generic caricatures that we have in the press here.
Sure, and even going back further, before Chavez was first elected president, which was in 1998, I first went to Venezuela in the early 1990s because of a family connection, and 1993 to be precise. That was a time period of incredible turmoil in the country. I mean, it's ironic because it seems like a lot of it has come full cycle, although it's different for different reasons today. But back then, you know, the country, Chavez himself, as a lieutenant colonel in the army, had just led a military rebellion or attempted coup against, at the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was a member of one of the ruling parties in the country, was serving a second term as president, non-consecutive, and was incredibly corrupt and had been charged with impeachment. And before, just a few years before, in 1989, when there had been massive uprisings in the streets of Venezuela against austerity measures that this president had promised he wouldn't enact. And that's how he got elected. And then, of course, he did that. So there was this massive uprising, strikes, riots, everything. And what that president at the time did was order the troops out in the streets to literally massacre the people. Over 3,000 people were killed in 1989 in what was known as the Caracazo, this big Caracas explosion, one of the first sort of popular uprisings against neoliberalism and, you know, globalization, austerity measures. So Chavez sort of rode in on that, going out against a corrupt, murderous administration that then, he failed in that coup that he led. He went to prison for a couple of years until he was later pardoned by a subsequent president. But during the period when I first got there, that's what was happening. Mm-hmm. And that government, what happened was that president was they don't have the same model of impeachment. He was forced to resign. He fled to Miami, where he lived until he died a few years ago with the wealth that he stole from the country. Mm-hmm. And the economy plummeted. I mean, it was just a nightmare. Inflation, the currency devaluing, and just chaos. But beyond that, at that time, the government imposed complete restrictions of human rights. In fact, as like a national decree, no guaranteed civil rights, human rights, no freedom of expression, no freedom of assembly. There was a national curfew imposed. There was a forced military draft in a country with no, military enemy. It was just sort of a way of controlling the people, and mainly the poorer people. So, that's sort of how I got inaugurated into Venezuela, was in a time period of a lot of turmoil and crises. And so Chavez, when he was pardoned in 1994 under a new president who was still from one of the sort of traditional parties, he began to build this movement. It took 4 years, but he across the country built a movement that was aimed at eradicating corruption, breaking this reign of two parties that ruled the country for over 40 years since the last dictatorship in 1958. And then also, redistributing the oil wealth of the country. Oil was nationalized in 1976. It wasn't Chavez who did that, but the country was running like a private corporation, and there was 80% poverty. So he was elected in 1998 on a new party that he created, a new movement that was aimed at eradicating corruption and poverty and redistributing the wealth and, looking more towards social justice. He wasn't per se declared leftist or radical. He was a military man, but he did have that sort of discourse, more nationalist, more focused on equality, on the country's independence, on the country gaining control of its own resources and using them for the benefit of the people. Mm-hmm. And so that's what people saw in him. And then he had this project of the Constitution. He was elected on this platform of, we need to rewrite our Constitution. This is a Constitution that, was done by this political elite after the last dictatorship in 1958, and it doesn't reflect the true reality of our country. So he was elected with a majority to do that. Then it went to a popular referendum. People voted, overwhelmingly 80% or so, 70, 80% to rewrite a Constitution. Then they elected the people to do it. Then it was done in this really open way. And that's how I sort of got back involved, was in this process. I was in law school at the time when they were writing this Constitution. It was a pretty incredible process to witness, a whole country of people writing a Constitution. It ended up having 350 articles and addressing all areas of human rights. It's one of the more advanced constitutions in the world in that sense. So, originally that was the movement Chavez was leading. He was able to unite a lot of social movements, unions, leftist parties, that had been divided, similar as they have been in the U.S., for example. And so his leadership was able to sort of bring them all together. And those were the beginning years, was rewriting this Constitution, sort of getting things in order, enacting laws to guarantee that the oil wealth would be redistributed into social programs and focus on, bringing people's quality of life up, which is really what happened initially with that movement. And, it wasn't until he began directly affecting, U.S. interests and elite interests in his early years. Because, in the end, Venezuela, one of the reasons why it's important for people to understand that background somewhat is because Venezuela had long been a client state of the U.S., even before the democracy began in 1959, but it became a client state more so in the 70s and 80s and 90s, in the sense that U.S. corporations were running their oil industry, the
What's
government.
What's the primary oil, sort of U.S. oil company operating in Venezuela?
Well, now it's Chevron, but Chevron's the only one that stayed. It used to be Exxon.
Okay.
Exxon was the big one. And Exxon actually left the country in a big dispute in 2007 when it was discovered that Venezuela's largest oil reserves were this very heavy crude in the southeastern region of the country in the Orinoco River Basin that the United States had originally classified as bitumen, which is like a very heavy coal, not oil. Mm-hmm. So it didn't qualify under the 1976 laws in Venezuela of nationalization. And so it was like a free-for-all in that area that the U.S. corporations were controlling. Once, Chavez figured out, wait a minute, that's actually oil, that's not bitumen, it's just a very heavy crude. It was then subjected to the nationalization laws, and Exxon fought it. They wouldn't agree. And, I mean, we're not talking about, like, the Venezuelan state goes in and takes everything. It had to be 51% ownership Venezuela, 49%, foreign company. So it was still a really good deal. They would have to pay royalties and taxes on the profits, but otherwise... but Exxon said, no way, because this was ours. We're not giving any of it up. And if we have to give any of it up, we're out of here. And so they left, right. And then they sued Venezuela. I mean, so that's important because also, who is the Secretary of State in the U.S. today is the former CEO of Exxon. So there's a long-standing adversarial relationship. Yeah.
Right. So
that's important.
That's very important. There's two other kind of table-setting questions, though. And one is another piece of history that people need to contextualize this, and the other is kind of a little bit more skeptical, I guess, going back to Chavez and his time. But the other really important thing that I just would like you to also explain is, in addition to these disputes, there was also a coup. I think it was in 2002, I believe. Maybe 2003. Was it 2002?
No, 2002.
2002, which, clearly the Bush administration supported. Also, the New York Times humiliated itself by supporting. Chavez actually was returned to power very quickly, and the troops, the sort of like normal Venezuelan troops, were kind of not on board with it, and seemed like most people were still very committed to his project. Could you just briefly explain that history as well? Because I just think it's important that people know that, like, literally, there already was a coup in modern Venezuela. It just didn't work.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I was getting there with my little introduction. But
go.
So it was really after the that Constitution was ratified by a popular referendum in 1999, in December of 1999. They had new elections under the new Constitution. Chavez won again and was, inaugurated as president again in 2000. And then began, under the new Constitution, implementing laws. They began legislating under that Constitution, and some of it was land reform. Some was just hydrocarbons laws that, began to affect the foreign companies, mainly U.S., again, because they were requiring them to pay royalties and taxes that previous governments had just looked the other way on because they were enriching themselves with, bribery and whatever commissions they were taking. So those began to affect interest. And Venezuela took over the presidency of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, of which it's a founding member. And when Venezuela took over, it was $7 a barrel in 2001. Under Chavez's leadership, it went up to $25 a barrel. So that began to affect, of course, U.S. consumers, companies. And then, of course, there was his discourse began to radicalize more. He opposed the Bush administration's idea of expanding NAFTA into the Americas with a free trade of the Americas agreement. He was outspoken against that. He began to ally with, Cuba. I mean, not as close at the time, but still, there were things happening where it showed that Hugo Chavez was not subordinate to Washington, whereas other presidents in Venezuela had been. They were behind the scene. I mean, I knew him really well, so I know a lot of what went on.
And he also wasn't trying to kind of synthesize like the way Lula maybe was, where he was trying to do a kind of center-left platform and have left alliances, but also not piss Washington and IMF off. Chavez was definitely going on a more kind of adversarial track with regards not to, United States citizens, but to United States interests and corporate and government.
He wanted to have a good relationship, but in his eyes, it was, look, we're a country that has a lot of potential. we're a major oil exporting and producing country. We want to be treated on equal grounds. And he wanted, he had this sort of vision of the founder of Venezuela, Simón Bolívar, the liberator of, sort of realigning all the region, creating the Patria Grande, the grand homeland in Latin America, the independence and sovereignty of the region instead of it being the backyard of the U.S. So yeah, I mean, he was blunt, and he never hid under any kind of diplomatic language how he felt about that. So he became a target, and it was combined with the Bush administration backing this traditional elite in Venezuela. They attempted a coup against Chavez, and it lasted 48 hours. They took him out and had him sequestered on an island and off the coast of Venezuela. And whether he was going to be killed or not or flown elsewhere, we'll never fully know. But in that interim period, the opposition, many of whom continue to be the leadership today of the opposition in Venezuela, dissolved the constitution, all the established branches of government. It became a dictatorship. They persecuted Chavistas in the streets. Over 100 people were killed. It became very brutal and a reminder sort of Latin America's dark history of U.S.-backed dictatorships. And people said, wait, whoa, we're not going to let this happen. Are you nuts? This is not happening here. So, and then, of course, the armed forces were loyal to Chavez. Mm-hmm. So they came out, and together with the people, millions flooded into the streets. It became clear that people were not backing the coup. But in the interim, the Bush administration came out and supported it. Ari Fleischer, who was the White House spokesman at the time, came out and, gave this whole false storyline. So did CNN, all these different media outlets, New York Times, as you said, all applauding it, saying Chavez resigned. He ordered the killings of his people and stepped down. I mean, it was all a plot. That's what my first book is about, the Chavez Code, that I uncovered these documents using Freedom of Information Act that show how deeply involved the CIA was, the Pentagon, as well as State Department through funding via USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, funneling millions of dollars into the groups that prepared and executed the coup against Chavez. And so then after that coup failed, he was brought back to power. He forgave everybody. There was this period of reconciliation. Then the opposition tried it again through strikes and, other means throughout the years.
Has there been
sort of attempts continued?
Yes. I mean, okay. So I think that's important context for people, and we got to get to the present day pretty soon. But I mean, and again, this is my read of it. I'm curious. Was the experience under Chavez there were contradictions in multiple tracks? So on one hand, there was this incredibly progressive constitution, which actually now seems like it's being potentially toyed with by Maduro. There was a really progressive constitution. There was serious reforms and there were some cuts in poverty and some delivery for people that had never been delivered for under obviously either a military junta or the two traditional Venezuelan parties. But then there was also, the sense that Chavez, he definitely was winning elections. And I don't think up until under Maduro, there's ever been any credible allegations. And people always said that Venezuela under Chavez was stealing elections, but that was never credibly documented as far as I understand at all. But there was a sense that maybe he had some kind of authoritarian leadings, that there was also the policy design. If you're, building programs, of course the oil wealth needs to go to the people, but are you structuring it in such a way that it's sustainable, or in some ways, are you just riding a commodity boom like other governments ride commodity booms and doing it in a better way because you're delivering it with people, but at the same time, it's not durable and sustainable in the future? I guess what I'm just trying to say is before the wheels really start to come off, and clearly there's still a U.S. role there. And I want to also see if there are different parts of the opposition that we could start to disaggregate, and maybe also different parts of Chavismo now too. But were these problems that have been accentuated, whether they're economic management or the government responding in kind on human rights and suppression, were those already evident in certain ways under Chavez as well?
There was certainly a period of time that, was sort of the heyday of the movement, which was from the time he was reelected in 2006 with like 62% of the votes. It was a pretty landslide victory.
Right.
And oil was growing, it was in the, I don't remember, $60 or $70 a barrel. I mean, it was going up. Poverty was being eradicated. The social programs were expanding. The state apparatus was expanding. Everything was sort of falling into place in the region. Latin American countries were electing leftist presidents. They were aligning. They were creating regional organizations. They were all standing up against, the Bush administration. I mean, it was just it was a pretty positive moment for a lot of the region.
It's kind of the
general.
political hope of the world at that time.
Yeah, I mean, and what was happening in Venezuela was successful, or seen as successful at that time, because those, poverty really was being eradicated. People really were learning how to read and write. The medical system, free universal health care, was servicing millions and millions of people, and it was successful. I mean, everything seemed to be going well and progressing. And, then oil spiked at the $100 a barrel, and, Venezuela began spending even more lavishly, even throughout the region, Caribbean nations, giving away oil essentially, and spending on a lot of stuff, like spending, a lot of the money that was coming in, and budgeting in even more programs in the country. So, some ways I think that even though they always kept the budget to like $60 or $70 a barrel, even when it was at 100, there was still overly excessive spending. And even though Chavez did have a vision of diversifying the economy, of investing more in domestic production of other industries and in infrastructure, still it became overly dependent once again on the oil, and none of those other achievements were ever even came close to being successful. And then the corruption began to set in again. I mean, there's always been corruption there, but it became, they would nationalize a certain industry or company for X reason, and then take it over. The state would take it over, be given to whoever to be in charge, and then it would just fall to pieces, because either, one of the parallels I see in some ways to things happening in this country is that there was a big emphasis on loyalty and less on competence. And so a lot of people in the government were loyalists. They weren't experienced or competent. And so that became clear as the years went by, that things were not sustainable or successful, because there were no economists in the government.
And also,
running the economy.
And also that instead of and because at a smaller level there was some real experimentation with like giving and devolving power to communities, but there was like the failure of, okay, if we're basically just going to have like a modernized Latin American social democracy, you need to have real professionals who manage it, part of the management team, and that can't just be loyalists. And then on the other hand, if you're going to do real radical experimentation with who owns things and how, like worker cooperatives or how things are managed, then they can't just be part of a new political patronage network that's handed off to party loyalists and local bosses.
And that's what happened.
Right.
Because some of those were really cool ideas and amazing things that, we all were interested in and wanted to succeed, but then you would see what would happen actually. It would be an amazing moment when something started and they were provided resources and Chavez would be there for the inauguration, and then, a week later everything would fall apart. Because there was all this hype around creating it and making a big deal about it and using it sort of as propaganda, but then it didn't work. But that's not across the board. I mean, there are a lot of community councils and community-based groups in Venezuela, that are self-sustaining or try to be and are honest and, trying to actually do that in a successful way and are not corrupted. But unfortunately, it became a closer circle, and then as Chavez became more entrenched in power as the years went by, and then once, of course, he became sick, then things really closed up, and the closest group around him also became the most corrupt, And it was, some say, I can't say that he's devoid of any responsibility. He must be. But, having been close to him and been there, I can say, at least from my experience, that I never saw any corruption on his part, but I certainly did see it amongst others close to him, that some that he knew about and removed from his inner circle, but didn't, put them in a position where they would be actually punished or brought before justice. So then those people came back. And that's a lot of who's in power today.
Yeah, that's
people
Wall
that
Street,
actually he
right?
moved out,
Yeah.
now are back.
Okay, so bring us to today, because I think it was in 2013 he passed away. Nicolas Maduro came into power. Maduro, definitely just on a kind of basic level does not have Chavez's, charisma or, his, again, just his credibility of his sort of establishing a political movement. My understanding is that when Maduro first was kind of written about, and maybe this is just a kind of generic American press response to any successors, like maybe he's more of a diplomat, which could be code for, maybe he'll give Exxon its crude back or whatever. But things have really, really obviously gone in a very bad direction, and I want you to kind of explain the specifics of what's happening now with this constitutional assembly, how Maduro has failed, but then we'll also expand it to what the opposition movement really looks like. And I just want to stipulate, not as a specific question, but both when we talk about the opposition and the government and the Chavismo movement, it's very interesting to me. You mentioned before that there are still, local councils that are actually successfully implementing progressive local programs. To the extent to which you can draw distinctions inside the opposition or inside the government or inside the Chavismo movement, like as an example, these people in the opposition are fed up with Maduro and the government and its failings and its corruption and the fact that all the indicators are sliding back in the wrong direction in terms of poverty and crime, but they might actually be open to at least a center-left agenda versus, hey, these are the same people that implemented the coup and they're just back on in the streets and they just want to reconstitute oligarchy. And then the same with the government. If the elite is run by old, people that Chavez, in fact, got rid of, and they're running a giant patronage network, and it's clearly not working, and Maduro's putting his family in different positions of power. But if there are still people on the grassroots that want to preserve the purpose of this movement, and there's internal conflicts on both of these sides, I think that's always, sort of useful to know about and make those sort of distinctions. But anyways, get us back to, I gave you a lot there, but how did things go off the rails with Maduro, and where are we now?
I would say it's somewhat surprising because, people may have seen him as a diplomat because he was the foreign minister for 6 years under Chavez. But, of course, he's from the working class. He was a bus driver, a union organizer, not someone from that traditional elite. So I think that's the main reason why Chavez sort of chose him as who could replace him when he died. And, Maduro was elected by an extremely slim margin compared to what Chavez always got. Less than 2 points, but still a lot of politicians are elected that way in the United States all the time.
Certainly.
So he still won. It was questioned by the opposition, but they question every election that they lose. And in any case, he was never given the same legitimacy that Chavez had. And so that it got off to a bad start. But in any case, he was someone who seemed to identify more with this sort of grassroots movement. So it was interesting to see how it changed over the years. I think the first 2 years, it was more him sort of trying to get his bearings and figure out what to do because it wasn't something he was prepared for. And then with that, crisis of legitimacy, the opposition protesting because they did that initially as well. People died, it was violent. And then having to deal with the increasing economic crisis, which he then, horrifically mismanaged, horrifically. And the people who were in government who were sort of the more experienced, intellectual, capable, competent, left the government, the ones who were with Chavez, because they started to see things happening that they didn't like, which is what we're seeing now. A lot more of the corruption and that nepotism and secrecy. He's very opaque, sort of the way that he manages his government is done by an inner circle of loyalists, and they have a lot of interests of their own in that. And so, and he also comes from this, he belongs to some tradition of spirituality of like Sai Baba or some, I don't know, no judgment, but there's a lot
He's a
of
devotee of
secrecy.
Satya Sai Baba, really?
Him and his wife.
Oh wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Huh. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot
I don't
of
judge
sort of-
Indian spirituality, but I do judge Sai Baba.
Well,
I'll make
cult.
that distinction.
It's a cult.
Yeah, it's a cult.
Right. And,
exactly.
Yeah. So there's that angle that just adds to his own sort of oddness in that position and what was going on. And in any case, things got worse and worse as the economy really, sort of plummeted, because that's really what most people care about, is their survival every day. And so he was unable to address that. And it actually got worse and worse. And the people he brought in to sort of help with that did a terrible job, and things worsened. And so as that happened, instead of him looking for a way out that could have been more diplomatic, even though he did try, he reached out to the opposition to dialogue. It was just that the opposition leadership, and this will go to the second part of your question, the opposition leadership, they're like a coalition of over a dozen political parties from a diverse ideological spectrum, and they don't agree on anything except regime change. And so they all, struggle amongst themselves for power and who's going to be the one who's going to take over. So Maduro reached out to that leadership, but of course that leadership only believes in regime change. So they weren't really willing to dialogue or negotiate on much. And so it never got anywhere. And then the legitimacy crisis worsened as the economy got worse. So, and as that happened, he started to change. I mean, I say this, I know him really well, so I was really surprised, even just over the past year and a half. He became way more sort of detached from the reality and more sort of entrenched in this idea that he inherited the leadership. Chavez gave it to him. He's the son of Chavez. That's how he calls himself. And so therefore he's righteous in whatever he does. And that's how it must be. And anyone else who strays from that is a traitor. It's treasonous to even criticize. And that became more and more. But I mean, I think a lot of that is wrapped up in the fact that they have a lot of interests as well, economic. There's corruption in his inner circle that's really, widespread and borders on, like criminal organized crime. So, I mean, there's
connections with the
interests.
trafficking world, like kind of more of that type of thing too.
I don't have evidence of that, so I can't exactly say that, but I have seen other things. So I definitely know that there's, extortion network. I mean, there's all kinds of ugly things that go on, and which I'm sure go on in any major oil producing country, because there's just too much money. There's just too much money coming into the state, and people can't help themselves with the greed. So, it became, it's a very greedy inner circle there. But at the same time, I don't believe that it's fully malicious. I mean, I do, knowing him, I believe that he really honestly thinks that he has to carry on this project and defend Chavez's legacy, even as it's being destroyed by the policies that he's, implementing, and this sort of overall way he's carrying things out, and the people amongst him. So, as things just worsened in the country, and this year, well, actually, December 2015, there were elections for the legislative body, and the opposition took a major majority that was completely unexpected for the government, because they didn't believe what was happening in the country. They were so detached from reality. They didn't see the discontent as being real. So when that happened, they freaked out and thought, whoa, we've lost power of our legislative branch of government. This is huge. And so they made sure they stacked the Supreme Court with complete loyalists that would serve their agenda no matter what. And it's a different legal system. So the high court there has all these different powers that like our Supreme Court doesn't have. So their Supreme Court nullified some of the legislative bodies, the parliament's powers. They did everything they can to basically neutralize the opposition in the parliament, which drove the opposition nuts. And so then they started all these protests that began last year, and then this year spiked. And so once the street protest took off and became extremely violent, Then the government, it was out of control. They were anarchical. Even the opposition couldn't control what was going on. Over 100 people were killed. It went on for months. The country was at a standstill. The economy was still crashing. They were losing international legitimacy amongst, a lot of countries, not all. And so that's where this idea came from of, okay, let's do something else. Let's rewrite the Constitution. And so, which to me sounded,
it's a great accomplishment. Why would you toy with it?
Exactly. And the only justification was for them to essentially be able to fully nullify the parliament.
Okay.
And
that's a
to
bad
ensure, because they wouldn't win another election at this stage. Maduro's up there's presidential elections next year. He would not win. The government would not, the government party would not win at this moment. So this was sort of a way for them to regroup and rally the base again, because it is a grassroots process, even though there's the elite leadership of the government, the party loyalists are the ones running the whole show. There are grassroots people involved and community organizations, and they feel like they're participating. And even as the economic crisis continues, people feel again sort of active and involved, whereas they were feeling more detached. So it was a smart way to rally the base and get people involved in something they feel like they're participating in and are going to have an impact on, even if that's not the case. And then it was a way to neutralize the opposition entirely, because now if for the first time there may have been fraud in an election, which was only to inflate numbers, not actual process fraud, but to inflate the numbers to make it seem like they have more votes, now, the opposition is saying they're going to participate in the next electoral process, which is now set for October, as decided by this, constitutional assembly that's in power in the country now. And the opposition is going to participate in elections for governors coming up. So now they're basically legitimizing the electoral process again in order to participate, so that they don't lose, their regional seats of government, which they may or may not lose anyway, because there's all kinds of maneuvering going on. On one hand, again, the opposition doesn't agree on their candidates. It's not like they all want the same candidate for government or for president or any role. So now they're all promoting their own candidates. And then on the other side, the government-controlled elections council that oversees elections is busy nullifying candidates and parties from the opposition for all various kinds of reasons. And then you have this new supreme power in the country, which is rewriting the Constitution, even though they haven't even begun to rewrite a constitution. They're just decreeing things against the opposition. That's what they're doing, essentially, is that they're now saying they're going after anyone who promoted the protest in the country, or basically any kind of dissent. They're going to either be prohibited from running for office, or they're going to be jailed. And they're completely backed by the Supreme Court, which actually in Venezuela is functioning as though it's a criminal court. They're jailing people. Right. They're ordering arrests of opposition and critics in the country. So that's what's happening now. There are still, just to add in quickly, I know that there's too much information, but
it's fine. Go ahead.
There are still, grassroots movements. There are community organizations. There are, unions. There's sort of still that base that is not corrupted, but that says, well, the alternative is worse because we don't want the fascists back in power. So we're stuck with, the corrupt, party, loyalists that are in power. But at least they may be doing things that, people disagree with on some ends, but at least the policies they're pursuing are still policies that are favorable to that grassroots base and to the majority of, well, it's hard to say majority these days, but
I think so.
Sort of more social justice policy. They're trying to maintain social programs, healthcare, education, job programs, subsidized food. They're trying to maintain those programs, which are widely popular in the country. So it's either that, or the alternative would be neoliberalism and austerity and privatization, which is a return to the past.
So they need to find some opposition figure that can Lula it if it's possible at the moment.
But so far there's
there
none.
isn't anybody like that, right?
Not who has any kind of potential popularity at this time.
Right.
Anyone who's come out of Chavismo, who's critical of the government, has been labeled a traitor.
I see.
And even though there is a movement, very small, of the critical Chavistas, as they call them, it would be hard for them to garner power on a national level. I mean, there are some who are trying, but they're all being persecuted by the government.
It's always those guys. Like, I remember looking in Nicaragua, and Ortega also, like, just incredibly flawed leadership, and even alliances with the right-wing opposition there at times. And the most compelling criticisms of him came from, like, the real Sandinista movement, which went nowhere. But they were the ones that were right about everything. It's depressing.
Right. And I mean, exactly. What's happening internally there in the Chavista movement is that people who do criticize, including myself, you're then immediately either labeled traitorous or persecuted, or, the other people who agree with your criticism say, wait, don't do that, because you're giving the opposition ammunition against us. You're justifying what they're doing, or what the U.S. is doing, by Trump saying now there's a military option, or, Vice President Pence going, he's in Latin America this week, going around trying to build an alliance against Venezuela to push for regime change. So, it's this: are you with us, or you're against us? I mean, there's no middle ground in Venezuela. And then on the opposition side, none of those leaders who lead the parties that comprise the opposition coalition, none of them present any kind of real alternative. They're all either also corrupt or self-interested, or there's no, at this moment in time, there's not someone I could point to and say, there he is, or there she is.
Right.
But that's how Hugo Chavez came about, and it took him 4 years to build a movement, and he came about from the people being fed up and sick of corruption and an elite running the country into the ground. And so that's how his leadership was born and supported. So
well, here we are. And so
who knows?
And just as a final, really 30-second thought, I mean, it's very important, I think, for those of us on the left to have a rigorous, honest, kind of broad-based conversation about this. But you've got the oil curse, which is always there. Maybe we'll save that for another conversation. But from the perspective of being in the United States right now, I think that we should not have any kind of naive support or justification of this present Venezuelan government or Maduro. And at the same time, I think from our primary perspective, the United States, and it's more flagrant under Trump, but Obama had a very problematic Venezuela policy. Bush supported a coup, and obviously, that there's an area where there's no disharmony inside the Trump administration. They're all synchronized and trying to, position an oligarch government back in Venezuela, and that's probably first and foremost what Americans should have, or people in the United States should have their eyes on.
Yeah, totally. It's a state policy. I've been saying it for years. That it didn't matter. There was hope in Venezuela when Obama was elected, and I was like, are you guys nuts? It's a state policy. Right. Obama's the one that started the sanctions against Venezuela, labeling the country an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, which is ridiculous. Right. And now we've got Trump talking about a military invasion. So it's really just an escalation of an ongoing state policy where the end game is to regain control of the world's largest oil reserves. I mean, it's logical from a U.S. empire perspective. But I think that people need to be cautious in the sense that, yes, the government is inherently flawed in Venezuela. This current government, there are authoritarian tendencies, there are some violations of human rights going on, but on the other end, there is still a grassroots movement that's trying to push forward for a progressive social justice political project. And, that at least from my perspective, needs to be supported. And then at the same time, coming from the U.S., I mean, the number one priority should be to speak out or just be aware of any, further U.S. attempts to undermine Venezuelan sovereignty, because that's just unacceptable, embarking on another war for oil in a country that's really just across our southern border that is a democracy, regardless of the different threats against it today internally. There are people there who are honest and who are struggling for political processes on both sides, opposition, Chavista, whatever. So it's something that Venezuelans need to resolve. And should there be any outside involvement, it should come from Latin America. It should not come from the United States.
Ava Golinger, I really, really appreciate your time. I hope to talk with you again soon.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, we are going to go right to the fun half. That was went longer, but I think it's worthwhile. I'm still processing that. I mean, I think that it's a very tricky situation when you, and I want to hear more about the grassroots that still exists in Venezuela. Undoubtedly, as it presently is, the Maduro government, I mean, the project is a failure. I totally don't trust the opposition. And certainly the notion of a U.S. military intervention in there is insane and dangerous, not to mention the fact that we have continued through the whole process of working, feverishly to undermine this government. So there's a lot of complexity to it. And I think that she, obviously sympathetic to Chavez, but it's a pretty sophisticated perspective on it, which I'm just not seeing in many places in either direction. 646-257-3920, 646-257-3920. Join the Majority Report today. That's how this show happens. JustCoffee.coop. Get the Majority Report blend. Write a review of the Majority Report on iTunes. Obviously, also Patreon/TMBS for the Michael Brooks Show. 646-257-3920. The IMs are on. See you in the fun half.
Sad. She said, no, 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 no. Things are looking bad. She said, no, 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 no. And if it was up to me, I'd tell her a thing or three. Every time I see her look my way, I don't know, girl, what to say. Situation sad. She said, no, 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 no. Things are looking bad. She said, no, 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 no. And if it was up to me, I'd tell her a thing or three. No, no, no.
All right, we're back. Taking it early, back on the fun half. Ekrog. Genuine progressive reasoning applied to sex discrimination. I'm not even going to respond to this. I'm just going to read it in Peter Thiel. If Matt has thoughts, he can respond to it, although Matt's very grouchy today. Men compromise 50% of the... He requested that I not read your IM, Greg. Men compromise 50% of the population do drugs just as much as women. Yet 93% of incarcerated people are male. This is proof of systemic sexism. We must fight it. Well, I would not frame it in that way, but I would say that we systemically have way too many people in jail. that are disproportionately people, Black and Hispanic people, and maybe also men, I guess statistically, but I know that women being in prison is a major issue as well. So I would focus more on that as a reduce the prison population.
It's such
issue.
a weird move
like,
to go.
no one should be in jail for doing nonviolent offenses.
It's so obvious what this is when it's like, hey,
bizarre.
let's address this economic inequality. All right, let's address every single bit of inequality also at the exact same time, and then like frame it as if like that's comparable, like that men being arrested more. Yeah, it's a problem how much we arrest people. We're a massive police state, is bigger than any other on the planet.
Yeah. We're like comparable, like we're like in the Chinese and Saudi Arabia territory of this stuff. It's a major problem. If you wanted to, and obviously there's a massive and distinct racial component to it, but I just think like even people on the left who do like kind of like statistics arguments like that, if it's used to elucidate a specific and urgent problem, yes, but the answer should always be structural. Like I don't understand what your answer is. Do you just want more even prison rates for women, or do you want everybody to not be less people to be in prison in general?
He said
it's just a weird. It's like what is this obsession you've got?
When he called in, he said he wanted to have the types of discussions about the sort of inequalities that Norway has. But the problem is we're not Norway.
Norway has massively reduced income inequality.
Exactly. Those conversations become easier to have when you address the economics.
Right. Economics is the engine. And it's interesting that actually everybody from like pseudo woke neoliberal bullshit to, inadvertent or intentional fascist libertarians, or just kind of anybody who generally gets into these like weird sidetracks, never wants to deal with like the core. I know, okay. But I'll read the rest of it in a Peter Thiel voice. Sam, if you disagree and cite biological differences, you are obviously sexist, and your opinion should not be taken seriously. I don't know what you're talking about, but yes, Sam's totally sexist. I know you're going to say and I know what you're going to say, right-wing Mandela? What? Men were arrested and put away with a male police chief, male mayor, male governor, and even a male president. So there's no sexism. Well, that's not what I said. Right-wing Mandela would say, Greg, you must, as a matter of urgency, get laid. I think I have an idea where this obsession with gender difference might come from. Your deeply repressed libido that gets turned into these insanely boring and ridiculous phone calls and IMs. That's what right-wing Mandela says. But if you're just dismissing the experience men go through every day, first of the male police officers are more often women, and I have tape of them saying sexist things against men. Checkmate. I didn't even understand what that was.
Christ,
That's suckle your Uncle Tom. Whoa, I'm not going to read. Well,
this
okay,
is
I'm not
dumb.
gonna, yeah. Greg, you're a fucking lunatic. Go get laid. You must. Greg. Seriously. Look, if I was the type of socialist that Greg seems to think socialists are, I would put out a call and say, is there... I should make that joke. Greg, get laid. Tinder exists. Use it. Maybe there's like a specific Tinder forum for people who except there wouldn't be women, whether for biological or cultural programming reasons, are less likely to send complete fucking nonsense to daytime talk shows. You're calling?
No, that's definitely true.
Yeah,
that's
true.
biologically determined.
You're calling from a 509 area code. Where are you calling from?
Hey, Michael, this is Ronald Reagan.
Oh, how are you, Mr. Reagan? From the worst
Good.
to the best.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shout out to Greg. And I just wanted to say I've called a couple times and poked fun at our friend John from San Antonio.
Right.
And I just want it to be known to the universe. I don't know if he listens to Michael shows, but
I actually think he
should.
does, which surprises me. I didn't think he did, but he made a reference once where I think I just doesn't call. I'm not worthy of his call time, but I think he does listen.
Right. But I just wanted him especially to know that it wasn't good fun, and I didn't mean to offend or hurt his feelings.
I'm sure not. John is, in contrast to Greg, where when I say, Greg, I hate you, I'm not really kidding. Just kidding.
Oh, come on.
No, I'm kidding. No, I love Greg. I do love Greg, but I love John.
Seriously.
Like, I love John.
But seriously.
Yeah, but seriously. But seriously.
The thing is, I'm just a man. I'm flawed. I'm coarse and unrefined, and I'm prone to taking the teasing too far, and frankly, it often takes the touch and care of a beautiful woman to get me to see those flaws. So shout out to Josh from Chicago's mom. She really brought me around, after that show. We had a long talk, and she said, John from San Antonio is a person too, and you should probably call and apologize. So, anyhow.
Okay. Anything else?
The apology part is serious.
Yes.
But the other part, it's not so much. Anyhow, I'm curious. I've said for a long time, and I'm obviously like a privileged white guy, like in every possible way, but I've said for a long time that, the overt racism is gone, and it's all sort of doglessly coded stuff. And I think maybe that's why I found the march to be so shocking. Did that strike you at all too, or were you sort of aware of the fact that there were, these armies of neo-Nazis in the wake?
I mean, that's a good question. No, I guess would be the simple way to answer it. But Matt, do you want to add something first? And then I'll elaborate.
No, I feel the same way. I guess, and I don't know if this is a new sort of internet phenomenon, because I know these people were from all over the place. It wasn't just people from Charlottesville, obviously. But yeah, I would be surprised to see that many people in like North Dakota. I think I don't know, like that expressly white supremacist. I mean, I think it was shocking. I mean, more interesting, when people were saying that they were chanting "Jews will not replace us," I remember watching a video and be like, that's not what they're saying, you guys. They're saying you will not replace us. And then that Vice documentary come out where they're very clearly saying Jews will not replace us. And that moment of I remember my lack of credibility to the first time when I'm like, why? No, let's not get carried away, guys. And I was wrong.
I mean, I think that this stuff lays dormant. What is interesting to me is that the continuum of things that you hear, it shows that it's a continuum. Like I remember, I think one of the most bizarre examples of overt racism that I ever heard when I was a kid. I mean, like 10 years old. It stuck with me. I was at someone's house and there was like an ad for like a new sitcom. And this woman goes, finally, a sitcom with some white people. Right? Like this is like the mid to late, sometime in like the mid to late 90s. And it was just like, I got it at the time. It was like, wow, like this woman has no recognition of how anything works in this country. And she really thinks like that, Martin is like a threat to her. And I just think, I just think that like if you take those attitudes and then you add a couple of other things where, you can build your social media communities and radicalize, and then you got a president who gives you a wink, and then you've just recovered from having a black president. And then I also think, the economic is not exculpatory, but it is environmental. And I think like Corey Pine does a great job of explaining like even people that are relatively better off in terms of income and privilege, like everybody's just in this much more liquid and stable environment. And usually what people do when they're in those kind of environments is sometimes they either diagnose their problems correctly and, act well, or other times they just kind of try to find their own kind of personal path. And then other people, it's a very ripe time for things that are already in the system anyways, which is a tremendous amount of racism. I don't know.
It's very fascinating to watch right-wing people sort of twist and turn and do these mental gymnastics to try and distance themselves from those groups, but at the same time, they're swimming in the same pool. So
Yes.
there's only so much they can do. They sort of agree that the statues should stay up, but we shouldn't be Nazis. But fundamentally, their message was right, and sort of cultural agreement about, like today on the local talk radio, they were saying Washington State's going to have to change its name, going with the Trump line as if it were some sort of slippery slope. But it's interesting that they can't just denounce it and move on, because they kind of need those people.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Is that the Republican Party is the party of white identity politics, and and we had that interview, that guy who wrote the book on the creation of like modern center-right parties, and how a big part of it was all of a sudden, if you're in the kind of elite capital class and you're facing competitive elections, what could you possibly have to offer people, right? Like your whole core agenda is horrible for over 90% of the population by any objective metric. So, you play to people's identity. You play to their bigotry. And it's, what is hard though now is like, they all are swimming in the same water. They're following things to their natural conclusion. And I don't want to, it's disgusting watching Democrats still being like, there's a difference, this is about right and wrong, not right and left, and all that bullshit. But at the same time, it is a whole world of difference between Mitt Romney's obliviousness and dog whistling, but he has the ability to recognize and say publicly that this is a different moral universe, and then have a president who is, the only thing that I think would temper saying that he's just purely defined by his racism is I think his narcissism and selfishness supersedes everything. But like, he's a racist, and his response to this is, that's an unequivocal thing from a sitting president. It's unbelievable. Right.
Are you guys going to play the crying Nazi guy?
No, we're not.
We're not. Why? What did you think about that?
Well, it's just my favorite video of all time. So.
We're kind of leery of it because as if he's laying down the predicate for Nazis to commit violence. Like they're victimizing themselves in preparation to start smashing people.
I see. Yeah, I guess that's a good point.
I don't trust that guy. Michael was saying he seems like a bit of a attention seeker.
Yeah, that's another thing with some of these people is like, how do we?
You guys saying it's a false flag?
It's false flag. I have the document. Matt and I were talking about it. It's totally unprompted. And he's a Trump operative. He goes back to the. That'd be great if we just started doing like. He actually used to be a congressional aide to Paul Ryan.
Actually, we should do that, Alex Jones. We should do that Alex Jones sound about the Seinfeld, the people the FBI agents and underneath, it was Klan members, and he said they were all Jewish actors. Have you heard about this?
Do you have that on the list?
I can find it here in a second.
Let's do it. Anything else to add, Mr. Reagan?
No, that's it. Have a good one.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Later.
While you get it, I will take one more call. You're calling from a 646 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? 646. Are you falling asleep because the show's so boring? Like, what's the shtick?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, got it. You got it. Even if you're calling with a premise, you got to get on it. You're calling from a 267 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, how's it going, guys? This is Fran from Philadelphia.
Hey, what's going on?
Hey, So I just wanted to say how much I loved the Ava Golinger call.
Thanks.
Discussion. That's something I've been hoping for a while. I've been meaning to call. Hey, talk about Venezuela. I need to know more about that. Every time ever since I picked up that Taking Power Jacobin mag issue, which is very high context, and I want to know more. Anyway, great
Awesome.
stuff.
Good.
I had a question for you about that topic, and then just a highlight I wanted to give. And I'll start with the question first. Did you ever get glimmers of a possible future political landscape that looks like Venezuela in the regard that in the U.S. In the regard that the left is in power and the center right revolts? How do you think it would be different from this classic pattern of the left taking power and then the financial sector essentially holding the economy hostage for
Well, I think we need
leverage.
to go back and look at how FDR handled that, because there definitely was. I mean, there was even talk of coup among certain members of the corporate sector then, and I have no doubt the Bushes, right? I mean, look, if Bernie Sanders was elected president, and we're talking about obviously just in reality in the global. I mean, I'm not underselling him at all. He's great. But in the global reality, an incredibly modest, soft social democracy program that he would be promoting with really very little, I don't think much deep challenge of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, there would be a endless drumbeat from the kind of dumb center through the right to delegitimize him. And I think that in some ways, that is actually why. And I don't want to be look, Bernie would have won and Bernie should have won and everything would be better if Bernie was president, right? We shouldn't be too in our heads about this stuff. But since we are in the crisis that we're in, it's important to really think about that. What would it actually look like if and in America, it's not going to be, at least anytime soon, it's not going to be Chavez. It's just going to be at best a genuine center left. What kind of, and I think building out, I mean, that's what this show is. That's what, all these new shows and Jacobin and media and movements popping up. I mean, ultimately, I think in the first wave, as far as I understand it, and, obviously I wasn't working in it at the time and I was, kind of tuned into it, but not, professionally. But my understanding from talking with Sam and kind of getting a sense of the wave that happened under Bush with Air America and the blogosphere and stuff, and even in all of that was it was about correcting the record and counteracting this really virulent and toxic and totally dominant conservative media, which was the propaganda arm of the Bush administration. But our task now is much bigger, I think, because we have to first of all, it's not about fact checking and finding people's hypocrisy, because that doesn't matter so much, but it's about really building a robust, powerful, full scale narrative, and then actually being a greenhouse for these ideas. So I think in an interview like today, the goal to me is give a really broad based understanding of Venezuela. And then actually, I think I love that you picked that up, in the back of people's minds, where do we steal from and copy? What do we want to reject and get away from?
Right.
Or where do comparisons just don't even make sense?
Exactly. That's why I'm kind of a recovering centrist in a sense, and that's why in a certain sense, but the picking up the taking power issue was I kind of really kind of pushed me over the edge in a sense of thinking in that way. The thing I wanted to highlight is about something that happened last night in Philadelphia. There was a Philadelphia is Charlottesville rally.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I wanted to mention it is just based on I went and it was fantastic. But a comment that Sam and I think you were involved with the caller about, how can we appeal to the right's Christianity, essentially? And Sam's response was, I think, very apt, was, well, it starts with the clergy. And I think, the issue that went unmentioned, but is, of course, there is like, why do the clergy not appeal to these sort of humanist, for lack of a better term, or even leftist perspectives? And it's because, well, they have an interest in maintaining this kind of fear and this alignment with the right. It helps their constituency.
Right.
But I wanted to highlight the efforts of the religious left. And I know it's relatively small, and I don't think we should overstate it, but it's really there. And the organization that organized the rally is called Power. Philadelphians organized to witness, empower, and rebuild. Very well connected with Unite Here and the union advocacy organizations in the region. But it's clergy led. I was last night. There were people in collars going up and down the lines with megaphones, leading the chant, and it culminated at the right at City Hall, or north of City Hall at the Arch Street Methodist Church, in the shadow virtually of this racist Frank Rizzo statue that BLM has rightfully said should be taken down.
Right.
But it started. It was outside of a church. I don't think most of the people there were religious people, and it started with a prayer, and the people who spoke were clergy or interfaith leaders.
I'm totally
one of them,
supportive of the religious left, and one of the reasons.
Absolutely, it was exactly. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I don't,
just for your listeners.
No, I think that, and I would like to highlight that a little bit more, and I just think that anybody who, that's another one of these historical literacy things. Like it or not, the religious left has always been a major part of everything from Dorothea Day to MLK to Joshua Heschel. Every type of labor to human rights to civil rights, anti-war movement in the United States has always had a religious left, and I think that that's another reason that, again, I have no problem. Most people I know, I'm sure, atheists, and I would consider myself, I guess, an agnostic, but people need to not look at religion per se. They need to look at what type of religion is being manifested, and this kind of crude adolescent response to religion actually not only is wrong when applied to really serious and important issues for people to have some sophistication on around with regards to Islam and foreign policy, but also if you're interested in empowering a kind of broad-based left coalition here, some people in many different parts of the country and many different backgrounds take that stuff is important to them, and I'm not interested in having the actually the Bible argument. I don't really give a fuck. If you're if you support marriage equality and a proper science education, and you consider that your sense of kind of love and empathy and justice comes from having a deep Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Sikh or whatever faith, I mean, I'm sorry. I not only could not care less, I'm actually curious about what your experiences are and how that stuff influences you. I appreciate the call, man.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Talk to you guys.
Okay. Alex Jones. Matt, what did he say here? Or this is the Seinfeld. I guess this barely even. This is his spin on Charlotte.
Well, this is his spin. He's talking about how the time that he protested the KKK, but it's not quite that.
The time he protested the KKK.
As it shows up.
Why? Because they were like a Soros front group, or because he opposes racism?
Yeah, there's hours of this online. There's so much cussing, I can't play it. Here's a little bit of audio of me 18 years ago protesting the KKK. There's no big crowd of Antifa there supporting me, and them threatening to kill me, everything else. And it later came out that they were federal agents, like I said. Wasn't even real. I mean, quite frankly, I've been to these events. A lot of the KKK guys with their hats off look like they're from the cast of Seinfeld. Literally, they're just Jewish actors. Nothing against Jews in general, but they're leftist Jews that want to, create this clash, and they go dress up as Nazis. That footage in Austin, we're going to find it somewhere here at the office, where it literally looks like the cast of Seinfeld, or like Howard Stern in a Nazi outfit. They all look like Howard Stern. They've almost got the little curly hair down, and they're just up there howling Hitler. You can tell they're totally uncomfortable. They're totally scared, and it's all just meant to create the clash.
Can I stop getting the KKK? I was told clearly by my agent that the last time I went to the torch rally that I would get a role on a primetime sitcom. And then they say, no, you'll need to go to Auburn to do another Klan rally. How does this, I have to say, and I'm proud to say it, but none of those fucking scumbags in Charlottesville looked like they were anywhere on the cast of Seinfeld. I was to say, Seinfeld is one of the most insane racial casting things in the world. They like literally created a New York City without black people. But I will say, it was also a New York City like without any inbred looking, WASP types or like people with, khaki collections to match their insecurities. So I don't know how Alex Jones's theory fits in on that. We're going to play a game now. And this is another foreshadowing of a game that we will be doing on the Michael Brooks Show. And maybe this show as well, time to time. And this could be anybody. Today it does happen to be Trump. And this is from a couple years ago. In fact, this is the year 2013. So maybe people who are keen cinema buffs might know what he's talking about. But we're going to play a little game of guess what movie Donald J. Trump in 2013 is talking about.
One of the most racist movies I've ever seen. I thought it was terrible and a disgrace. When they talk about guns and gun control, that movie, people should watch that. You want to talk about something really with a problem. But I thought it was terrible. And overall, I thought that the event was...
So, maybe you might think that Donald Trump, after
Birth of a Nation,
right? I was just thinking like he had just been making a name for himself as the preeminent birther, fueling insane, unhinged, racist conspiracy theories about President Obama. So maybe someone had gotten to him and said, "Hey, look, can we, sit you down with a bunch of fast food, and you can live tweet watching Birth of a Nation." And maybe you'll get a semblance of a racial education. But, of course, that was not the case. That incredibly racist and horrible film.
Death Wish.
Death Wish. That's another good guess. That was sort of a vigilante film. Shows some of the sort of, the violence of New York in the 70s and some kind of like wish fulfillment. That's another a very, very solid pick. A really... almost, if you're just specifically talking about gun violence, pretty much any Hollywood blockbuster, but he did say racist. So, and Death Wish has pretty weird racial dimensions there. It's basically a...
What?
It's a hero fantasy of basically like an affluent white guy getting in the subway and murdering a bunch of black people.
Hero.
But if you were guessing Django Unchained... or if literally as soon as you heard most racist moo and you went Django Unchained, you're exactly right. That's what Donald Trump was talking about. That totally unfair movie where slave owners and people who are depicted forcing slaves to impale each other with a hammer, people using dogs to literally rip a body apart of an escaped slave, and also a movie basically that Quentin Tarantino does this brilliant thing where he goes back and he picks the most obscene humans in world history, slave owners and Nazis, and then he shows them at work. And then he makes the kind of grindhouse movies that he wants to make anyways, but you're at a point where you feel no moral compunction watching somebody's like eyeball get popped out or their brain engorged with a baseball bat because it's a fucking slave owner or a Nazi. But that's the normal human reaction. Donald Trump's human reaction was racist. And by the way, Leo DiCaprio told Jamie Foxx that he was 1 in 10,000. Seems like a pretty nice thing to say to somebody, and then you shoot him.
What, do you want to pop George Washington's eyeballs out?
Now we want to pop, I guess, Thomas Jefferson. Maybe Thomas Jefferson owned Candyland. Unfair. Where does it stop? Thomas Jefferson made love to Sally. Where does it stop? You know, Thomas Jefferson had a black girlfriend.
So how could he be racist?
So how could he be racist? By the way, I tried to sexually assault Robin Givens when Mike Tyson wasn't around, so how could I be racist? Totally unfair. There is nothing in American society. I mean, I know I said this the other day. There is nothing from fast food to racism to, like, again, I'm not neurotic, so I can say this. White male privilege, whatever the fuck term you want to use. Capitalism, trust funds, real estate, queen scumbaggery, massive insecurity, preening and posturing, and every type of undiagnosed emotional and mental illness to pretty clearly potential desires for incest. There is nothing that to sexism that Donald Trump does not possess. He is like literally he is the embodied endpoint of everything that's bad about our culture. And his only redeeming quality was that he was funny in the primary. Where did that go? He's been on a sophomore slump the whole time this asshole's been in office.
Yeah, I mean, if you say the Iraq War was a big fat mistake and hit on Republicans, we're going to enjoy that. But
of course,
we know why he did that.
Yeah, we know. If you're going to dox Lindsey Graham, I'm going to enjoy that. If you're going to completely emasculate Jeb Bush, I'm going to enjoy that. But it's also like the other thing. Another great reflection is just think of what a total pathetic, imploded manhood was on stage with him. That he could emerge as like the head ape in that gathering. I mean, it just and that was the deep bench of these utter, corporate tools and massive mediocrities that this racist trust fund baby scumbag could outmaneuver them at every angle. Just pathetic. Speaking of just pathetic, here is a woman whose name really should not get any attention, but she did say something that was so egregious, so stupid, so bigoted, and so exactly her job as a black conservative on Fox News that we had to play it. Here's Star Parker.
Think about Nancy Pelosi, who made this statement yesterday. It shouldn't take the President of the United States 2 days to summon the basic decency to condemn murder and violence by Nazis and white supremacists.
That is not what happened. Nancy Pelosi is exploiting an opportunity that they think will play to their side. On Saturday, there were two sides that were in an American city and it was escalating very rapidly. No, the question became then, well, do you denounce the one part of it? But you know what's really interesting and a really incredible irony here is the same people that are demanding that the Confederate flag comes down are the same people that are insisting that the rainbow flag goes up. These two flags represent the exact same thing, that certain people groups are not welcome here. So if Nancy Pelosi wants to say that we're going to start shutting down First Amendment rights of a certain group of people, then what happens the next time that the homosexuals want to walk through an American city and protest and counter-protesters come out?
All right. Star Parker joining us today from Washington, D.C.
I think the value of that clip is that in a world, bless you. I think the value of that clip actually is in some ways with a world with Alex Jones, with a world of Nazis and people and Tucker Carlson playing footsie with these people and the internet and the soft alt-right Dave Rubin thing and all of that garbage. It's very important to remember just how totally obscene and grotesque normal day in and day out Fox News programming is. Like Fox News is almost, with the exception, I guess, of Hannity as the kind of main propaganda piece and Tucker Carlson playing his game with bigots, that clip is just a normal, like, hey, she's with the moron crew in the morning. She's comparing, first of all, a couple of things. She doesn't understand as fucking Mitt Romney does the different moral universes of those promoting Nazism, bigotry, and racism and those fighting it. There was one person killed. There were over 30 injured, and they were the good ones. None of the bad people died in Charlottesville. I don't want anybody to die, but let's be very clear about that. There was no equal exchange here. A young woman who was a hero and an advocate of everything that's right was murdered by a fucking Nazi. And then she has the temerity to compare, I guess, well, like a group rights group of people who go out with a rainbow flag to say, hey, can you give me equal civil rights, not murder and beat me because of who I am? Stands on the same ground as people who want to preserve monuments of slaveholders and mass killers who committed terrorism to undermine the founding of the modern version of this country. And that's just a normal Fox News hit. It is, even after the death of Roger Ailes, the ouster of Bill O'Reilly, Fox News remains utterly rotten to the core, and its core brand proposition is day in and day out casual racism and fear-mongering. So good job to both of them. They did exactly what they're supposed to do.
I wonder if Peter Thiel would like the idea of a gay confederacy, though.
That sounds amazing. Isn't it so weird that, like, this black chick gave us the most amazing idea ever? Maybe we can invite her for, like, the inaugural ball and then send her on her way the next morning. A gay confederacy. We could have, like, uniforms and blood. Let's see. Let's do, okay, so Steve Bannon, I would imagine has to be on his way out. There's been rumors for a long time that Bannon is on the chopping block. No doubt that hashtag President Bannon thing that happened in the winter was upsetting to Trump because Trump is a insecure baby and freaks out at any potential undermining of his leadership and his ego. And it's no secret. I mean, the thing about Steve Bannon, and I'm just saying this clinically and objectively, Steve Bannon is probably, there are a bunch of total clowns and D-string people in the Trump White House. Then there's some military guys who have a very dangerous military industrial complex agenda, but have a sense of competence and basic professionalism that might rein Trump in. Then you have Tillerson, who's actually pretty marginalized, but is a traditional just sort of oil empire guy. And then and then you have Cohn and Mnuchin, who are just, and then Wilbur Ross, just kind of, corporate scumbags.
The globalist.
The globalist. Steve Bannon is a bigot, dangerous. He's also definitely, he's probably the most sort of appropriately situated in the White House. He does have some strategic understanding. He did have a very astute insight of running Breitbart as an extremist tabloid, which appealed to xenophobia and bigotry, and then also setting up a low-key nonprofit which put out that Clinton Cash book as a sober piece of investigative reporting, but still a lot of that reporting was totally garbage and discredited, and getting a partnership with the New York Times. He knew that in order to seed stories in the mainstream, you needed to present them in a much less rabid manner. And anyways, yesterday, he tracked down Robert Kuttner. Now, Robert Kuttner is an editor at the American Prospect, a venerable old liberal writer. I shouldn't say old, I guess that's rude, but a veteran liberal writer. He's been around for a while. Smart guy, edits the American Prospect, good, liberal journal in Washington, known in our sort of circles, and doesn't have a particularly big kind of national profile, but highly, highly respected. Steve Bannon tracked down a column that Robert Kuttner wrote about North Korea, where Kuttner, in fact, insulted his boss. This is a quote from Kuttner's original column. In Kim, Trump has met his match. The risk of two arrogant fools blundering into nuclear exchange is more serious than at any time since October 1962. Well, that's exactly right. And Kuttner explains that he was very surprised when he got an email from Bannon's assistant that Bannon wanted to speak to him. And his first thought was maybe Bannon wanted to, chew him out on the phone. They ended up getting on the phone. And Bannon said, it's a great honor to finally track you down. I've been following your writing for years, and I think you and I are on the same boat when it comes to China. You absolutely nailed it. And then Bannon goes on to actually explain in a nativist and in light of other things he said about the fact that we're definitely going to have a war with China, some rather disturbing comments indicating his attitude with China. But the basic read that actually China in some ways benefits from this stalemate and is kind of riding off of mutually assured destruction as to nothing actually happening. He told Kuttner, in clear contradiction of fire and fury, that there was no military option to North Korea and that they needed to think about potentially sanctioning China and taking on China directly to solve the issue. He then bragged about all of the people that he was marginalizing in defense, treasury, and state departments, which does seem a little bit contradictory for his sort of the adamant denials that he's one of the prime White House leakers and using leaking to undermine people like McMaster. And of course, Kuttner, asked him, since he had him on the phone, about racism and ethno-nationalism, because, as of course Bannon bragged when he was running Breitbart, that Breitbart was a platform for the alt-right. And he dismissed, and I'm quoting now from Kuttner, he dismissed the far right as irrelevant and sidestepped his own role in creating it. Ethno-nationalism, this is Bannon. Ethno-nationalism, it's for losers. It's a fringe element. And I think the media plays it up too much. We got to help crush it, help crush it more. And Kuttner had a great line which said, from Bannon's lips to Trump's ear. And then he said, the more Democrats talk about identity and they want to talk about racism every day, if the left is going to focus on race and identity and we go with economic nationalism, we crush the Democrats. I think that there is you can hear in Bannon that if he had a disciplined, intelligent president, he could have an incredibly dangerous strategy that could actually implement a form of economic populist fascism. But all the highfalutin talk, the occasional insight, and him being completely unhinged, there was something that Bannon forgot to do, which was that say he was off the record and not being interviewed. So now this is blowing up all over the place, and this punches all of Trump's biggest buttons. He undermined him in North Korea. He spoke essentially, and Kuttner noted this, as if he was the president. And then weirdly, considering his background in the formation of bigotry and racism, spoke out much more clearly on, I will reiterate, the losers that were in Charlottesville. So if he doesn't get fired, how many copies of a theoretical tape of sex games and peeing does Steve Bannon have? Did Putin give him the tape directly? This is a clip of that happened on MSNBC this morning with Axios reporter Jonathan Swain talking with Brian Williams about how Bannon was almost certainly blindsided by what happened with the American prospect.
Jeremy Peters of the New York Times is standing by to talk to us. But in this first one, tell the folks who haven't had the benefit of reading it, that quote was the tip of the iceberg. What else is in here? What else is in here about the military and North Korea?
So I should tell you that that piece that you quoted that I wrote this evening has just been updated because Steve Bannon has told associates that he actually didn't know he was being interviewed. He was calling up this person who wrote the piece about China, thinking that he was talking to a China ally, and for whatever reason did not say that it was off the record, and looks pretty bad. Now, it's actually an extraordinary interview. When I read it, I had a very strong feeling that Steve Bannon didn't know he was being interviewed because he did a few things that he wouldn't normally do, even when he's in his blustery, I want to show you, how big my muscles are mode. He spoke like he was the president. And that is a really big sin in Trump world. He talked about things that he would do, people and staff that he would remove from the State Department. He undercut the president's policy on North Korea. He said there is no military option, that there was no way to solve this militarily, which is directly contradictory to Donald Trump's fairly bombastic rhetoric. And then he started trashing colleagues. He said he was in a war with Gary Cohn and the Goldman Sachs crew. We knew all of this stuff, but for him to say it to someone that he's never spoken to before, you're going to hear some people say that he's playing some kind of, I called it five-dimensional chess, that this is part of a devious strategy. I guarantee you it's not. It's just plain sloppiness.
Well, guess what, Mr. Swain? There is one person who does think that this is 5 or maybe even 6 or maybe even 10-dimensional chess, and that is a reporter or journalist or commentator, whatever the fuck we're going to call you, who I think has much more credibility than you, super producer Matt Leck with a theory.
I mean, I'm not certain on this, but I think it might just be chess. I think Bannon knows he's out because as we started this week with him fighting McMaster and others, he's trying to make it so it's not, we're going to get rid of him because white nationalism freak out. It's because he has these positions that are like more respectable.
Right. I think that's a good theory. So, but then what? Because I think that one of the reasons that it is genuinely scary for them to get rid of Bannon is that Bannon is obviously, he's adept at media, and there is a certain contingent, and this is a weird thing here because his contingent is part of that racist base that he's cultivated. And I think that they're afraid of alienating those people. But if he's positioning it as, I'm actually not into I'm an economic nationalist, not an ethno-nationalist. And so I'm out because I've been fighting a valiant war against the establishment. It kind of puts him in an interesting position on the other side of it. Because presumably he's going to want to rally the troops and, kind of get some revenge. But he's calling his troops losers.
Which makes it easier for them to fire him.
Yeah. Unless he has a P-tape.
Yeah, we'll see.
You're calling from an 817 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Daniel from Dallas.
Hey, Daniel, what's on your mind, man?
Well, I had one particular thing I wanted to call in about, but, naturally there's a couple of things on the radio show that kind of got me thinking. So I thought maybe I'd just throw in a couple of quick things and then the thing that I was going to call about. The quick things include regarding Venezuela, the idea that I think we should always have skepticism of the narrative that our politicians want to use when talking about Latin American countries.
Right.
Because much of our entire last 50 years in dealing with Cuba, for example, was because they refused to bend the knee to American imperialism.
Right.
So it's
right, and that's a great point
too,
because that also does not, and also Cuba has great domestic accomplishments, and of course, the Castros violated human rights, and of course there wasn't freedom, and of course they did that's exactly the kind of conversation we need to have, where we can just take in the reality of all these things at once.
Yeah, and that's of course not discounting the fact that the Maduro government is a disaster. So
right, exactly, it's all true.
Anyway, moving on from that, the other thing I wanted to note, just as a quick thing, regarding the discussion that you briefly had about, I think, the difference between men and women in prison, where you made the point about economics driving a lot of our issues. From my sociology education, I'd like to mention a name that people can check out.
Sure.
The late sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox.
Oliver Cromwell Cox.
Did groundbreaking work in discussing the for-profit nature of racism. That racism was invented to justify basically colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and he used historical examples to sort of discuss that.
You need a narrative to justify going to other people's homes, stealing their things, murdering, enslaving, raping them. You need a story to fit with the base economics and instincts that drive that, and that's the story of imperialism and colonialism. Yeah.
Right, and the sort of the nuts and bolts conclusion of that is that, in a sense, the talking about like men and women in prison is sort of a pointless exercise because, as you pointed out, it's really all about economics. That you can't have intersectionalism without a discussion of economics.
Right,
because it
but at the
drives
same
those
time, I mean,
divisions.
I think we need to just be careful. I think the problem is that I'm probably a bit more in my framework. I'm probably a bit more Marxist than intersectional, but I do think that the problem is that if you read like Kimberly Crenshaw, she's brilliant and she weaves these things together, and then you're kind of moving in between what you foreground or not, right? So, or even generally like in kind of in any type of even more Marxist-oriented post-colonial theory, not to get too abstract about it, but that basically like that was the contribution that we're not going to just recruit because first of all, because these things take on a life of their own. So even if something had an economic origin, they become such a potent force in our culture, our institutions, and in our psyches that it's not, it can't just be addressed by economics alone because it shows up across all platforms in individual culture and society. So I think that the point being that we need to make sure that as we respond to a very stupid and disingenuous arguments that are put forward by that pseudo-woke neoliberal wing, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because what they're just doing is they're bastardizing some ideas that are actually very important, very rigorous, and very true, or even if we disagree with them, they're rigorous and they're important, right? Like they're just doing the knockoff Cliff's Notes bullshit version of some very important work that needs to be dealt with and centered some extremely important and specific conversations with regard to race and gender and everything else. Appreciate the call, man.
Yeah. Oh, one other point I'd like to make really quickly, and this is actually what I initially called in about, but I think I could keep this one pretty quick.
Okay.
This has been discussed to death already. The discussion about the balance fallacy regarding sort of there was violence on both sides and that sort of thing. There was a discussion I had with somebody yesterday, a Facebook friend briefly, who I thought was more progressive, who then decided to start discussing the alt-left. He cited something called horseshoe theory. I looked it up and wasn't very impressed because I felt like it continued to make the fallacy of the idea that the left is merely just a mirror of the right. They essentially believe the same things, but I don't buy the horseshoe theory because I think that it oversimplifies. It's not a horseshoe to say if you want to gas 6 million Jews, that not gassing 6 million Jews, I mean, that's not a horseshoe. And I just think I think that, of course, then I caught him making some racist statements, and
well, that's not a surprise.
To me, so.
Appreciate the call, man.
There's always a market for that sort of thing because it assures people that they're fine right where they are.
Right. Exactly. Right. You're calling from a 651 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Mariana from Minnesota.
Mariana. Hi, what's on your mind?
Hi. Hey, so Greg has obviously been calling and IMing in a lot. And
yes.
It's
exhausting.
Just got me thinking about what he's been saying, and it's something that I see a lot with people who might self-identify as men's rights activists, that they do actually cite real issues that face men, but they're always blaming the wrong root cause.
Right.
So,
Right.
like, I know some of the issues are kind of non-issues. There's, like, false rape accusations, which is just really a non-issue. But,
yes,
there
that's
are ones
not, that might happen in a personal, like, that might happen.
It's not
And
a
if it
systemic
happens, it's a
issue.
truly terrible thing. There is nothing structural about that at all. So, yes, we don't have to talk about that as a structural issue. Exactly.
It's kind of weird because obviously things that, like domestic violence that goes underreported, that has to do with, like, the ideas of sexism and, like, misogyny itself. It's just that affects obviously both genders. Nothing's a one-way street.
Mm-hmm.
And male suicide, the same thing, like, expected to repress emotions and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, even though I try explaining this, it seems like a lot of MRAs are just, they demonize intersectional feminism, third wave feminism, and doesn't really make sense, but it to me shows that people are serving themselves because they never talk about all men. They don't talk about like non-white men, the problems they face, gay men,
Every
trans
time
men,
they use a
immigrants,
prison
all this
example, and old Matt did this in one of these debates with one of those people. It was like they cite that prison statistic, and then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that is a really serious issue. So what do you think about sentencing laws? What do you think about police? Like, they don't want to talk about any of that. And I just, that's the thing. It's like, I use Adolph Reed as an example because Adolph Reed is a really important. I mean, he's probably one of the more underappreciated, important writers in the United States and political theorists. And he has like very potent critiques at times. Some I agree with, some I don't, of identity politics, and he writes from a black Marxist perspective, but really fundamentally a Marxist perspective. And I know some of the stuff but like, it's rigorous and there's a thought process behind it and it's something to confront. If you're encountering somebody on the internet who is like giving you some factoid, including even if it's, potentially a real issue that disproportionately affects men, but they're in that world, that's something that's driven by psychological and emotional issues.
And
it's
opportunism.
Not and opportunity.
That's true. That's Trump saying the Iraq War was a big fat mistake. It's like, this is what fascists do. There's a lot wrong in the world, and they opportunistically use whatever they can that works for them.
Yeah, so they're not going to, maybe some, I don't want to make categorically, maybe some people will that you're interacting with, but like in general, if somebody's coming at you with that shit, they're not good faith actors. They're just off in some dumb world.
I don't want to assume people are acting in bad faith, but after a long time, it's like they never offer any solutions other than like government should shut up.
Well,
problems will go away. I'm like, you don't care about this in the first place.
They've been inoculated, so in their mind they have these rock solid arguments, and in their mind they've been inoculated to any disagreement being irrational. So they don't engage at all. It's even if they want to be in good faith, it's sort of deprogrammed out of them. You see it, a soft version of this. I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but this is why I've given Harris attention, because it's more sophisticated and it's not quite as toxic, but it's the same thought process, and you can see where he's going now. It's starting to really bleed into each other. Every time his followers come at you, you can, and this is the other distinction. You don't have to agree with it, but like, you could post an article critiquing Harris by someone like Scott Atran, who, if we want to be a credentialist, has credentials from the best places in the world and teaches at Oxford and the Sorbonne, and actually does advising and ethnographic work on counterterrorism, right? So if you want to play that whole game that his people always play with his PhD or whatever. And then he's, written like a real piece outlining what Harris gets wrong. And again, agree, disagree, whatever. But the response is always like, oh, you just don't get it. Or you're blah, blah, blah. Or, I've done a number of videos where it's like, you can agree, disagree, blah, blah, blah. But when you start having people responding to you saying that you don't understand something or you're not smart enough to grasp something, and you've clearly actually, at least, for them, you're just doing a type of thinking that they're not capable of, but they're not even intelligent enough to recognize that they're not capable of. You're dealing with people who are in a cult and, and have that rock solid cult belief system. And that's all it comes down to.
Yeah, it's just reactionary because usually the times I see people bring up this issues is just in response to when someone brings up an initial issue, and it's like, well, what about men? It's not people bringing these issues up on their own.
Right. And then you say, well, what about history? And they say, well, we're not talking about that.
Right. And then they can get into all sorts of pretzels, because I could say, like, I remember one time I told some guy, I said, hey, I agree with you as an example. In, Saudi Arabia has gender apartheid. It's a structurally misogynist society because of the fanatical, because of political structure and because of the form of Wahhabism. So if Saudi Arabia transitions politically, I have no doubt that there will be a period of time where they will have to course correct in terms of women's rights and representation. And they're like, because if they accepted that, which is like their big, defining argument for everything, because Islam is so innately sexist, then the whole house of cards would come down on everything else, because then all of a sudden they'd have to accept history, which they, professionally don't do. Anyway, I really appreciate the call.
So, yeah, I was just going to say, I do think Greg has some good points. I just suggest
I
he
don't.
actually look
I
at, like,
disagree entirely, young lady.
stuff.
You don't have to say that.
You don't
Mariana.
have to say that. We all want to.
I don't know. I'm
We all want to decapitate Greg, but that's very sweet of you.
All right, fair enough.
Thanks for the call. You don't have to say that. You know why? Because I'm not even going to read it. But in the corner of my eye, I saw that Greg I'll just read the first two sentences to explain to you why you don't have to say that. Admit it. There are two sides to this Charlottesville stuff. LOL. Because being Antifa is a bit like playing Wolfenstein in real life. You can do whatever you want to a Nazi and no one really feels sympathy for them.
Yes.
Yes. Anyways.
It's an occupational hazard of being a Nazi.
It's yes, exactly. I think the Dems and left are Fish. I think the Dems and left are making a mistake if they allow this Charlottesville stuff to become slowly about Confederate statues. That's the argument the Nazis want us having, because it's a cultural wedge issue they can leverage to get people to sympathize with them. Dude, don't get so in your head. I agree. It's not just about the monuments. Make it about everything. But like, and again, this is another issue that if you were organizing on the ground in North Carolina amongst normal people, I guarantee you that they would be much more concerned about their wages and their housing than some fucking statue they walk behind. I don't support memorials to the Confederacy in public spaces, but if we allow Trump and the Nazis to pretend that this is like a fight between whether or not Confederate statues remain and frame it as to preserve history, that's a huge victory for them. I don't know about that.
The idea that this is taking these things down hurts history in any sense is fucking ludicrous. These things were put up to sanitize history for white supremacists.
That's exactly right. And it's part and parcel of the whole bigger argument and conflict that we need to have. And this is actually where I'll be a little bit idealistic. I think that anybody who's within the realm of being persuaded on this, who can take this seriously, is not going to get caught up in the monument bullshit. And I agree, we shouldn't shrink it to the monuments, but I wouldn't get so in our head about it. I think that footage that happened in Durham was great. It was beautiful. And, it was cool. Disco Stew. Thoughts on the story out of The Spectator reporting that Felix Seder has told his friends he's going to jail and so is Trump. Seems a bit too convenient to me. I don't know anything about that story. Also, do you plug... Can you do a plug for my current fundraising project? Osama bin NYC is it's to erect a great, beautiful statue of Osama bin Laden in New York City to commemorate 9/11. Osama bin. Wait a second. He actually made a website for this. I should even put the IP address for this site. Okay, he didn't actually do it. No, I mean, point taken. And if you can't get that point, then you're not equipped to have this conversation. Joseph Ballin, unless Republicans in Congress sponsor and vote a bill to formally impeach Donald Trump, they are enabling him. Absolutely.
They are enabling him.
They are, and they have for a long time. I think we can put to bed the debate over whether we should have Pence or Trump as president. Pence can't start a war like Trump. I agree.
With you there, too.
Totally with you. Very cogent points today. Nuclear Negroid. I'm having a hard time disagreeing with Bannon's major points in his interview. Help me out here, Michael. In that singular American Prospect interview, besides his like bullshit about Democrats talking about identity and racism, which wouldn't be that dissimilar from any number of kind of like mediocre pundits, and the specifics of some of the China stuff I didn't get into, I have a problem with, but no military solution on North Korea. They need to do more to crush ethno-nationalists. Yeah. If that interview was taken in isolation, I would find Steve Bannon the most likable member of the entire Trump cabinet. Okay.
I don't want to be profiled.
Well, just
I'm
what
not
you're
Steve
trying
Bannon.
to do. What you're trying to do.
I'm not Steve Bannon.
No.
I'm not trying to suck my own cock. I'm not trying to build my own brand off the fucking strength of the president.
Yeah, but don't you
I'm
think
here to
that
serve
would
the
be a
country.
good-
I think that interview is Steve Bannon sucking his own cock.
Oh, I agree. Oh shit! There was one other thing that I was supposed to do. Do you have that Ben Carson statement handy? Do you know what I'm talking about? He released it on Twitter, and it was like about Confederate flags. Sorry? Yeah, I guess we could do it tomorrow. All right. Snooze. Snooze and Sarandon. It's worth mentioning that teenagers Trump was advocating for a death penalty for in the Central Park 5 case were later found innocent and exonerated. Yeah, I said that. They never got an apology from Donald. Instead, he doubled down on infringing the rights of some to protect the law-abiding many.
I think as president, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, he's never. Yeah. Sam I Am. Hey, let's not blame Obama for Venezuela sanctions. A lot of people pushed for sanctions for Venezuela for drug trafficking and treatment of their political opponents. In fact, the Obama administration actually blocked them initially, but ultimately started sanctioning just 7 administration officials. The U.S. maintains a long list of economic ties to Venezuela. There's a tendency to just say sanctions to explain economic collapse of the country. It's not North Korea there. They trade with everyone. Yeah, that's totally true. But the notion of classifying them as a danger to the United States is a incredible stretch at best. By the way, Pope Francis is definitely a religious leftist and quite powerful. Joe Link, shortly after Trump posted a link for his tickets to a rally in Phoenix, the city's mayor issued a statement asking the president not to come. He said that if Donald J. Trump is coming to Phoenix to announce the pardon for convicted Sheriff Joe Arpaio, it'll be clear that his true intent is to inflame emotions and further divide our nation. See Raw Story article Felix Seder looking like he's flipped to help Mueller, saying he thinks he and Trump will both go to jail. Yusuf Salam was one of the Central Park 5 willing to be interviewed on MR. Oh, great. He fights racism and unjust prosecution. Can you send us an email about that? I have sent him I have sent contact email info for him by email. Oh. Okay, you've sent that before. All right, we got to find it. Okay, guys. Only 2 more calls. I'm sorry. You're calling from a 651 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? You're calling from a 651 area code. 651.
Hello?
Are you there?
Yes, it's the Chris Lopaco. Can you hear me?
Dude, Chris, the beat for the new show is fucking amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Incredible.
I appreciate that. Hey, I want to give everybody a trigger warning here. Greg, stop whining. All right, you make everybody look weak. You make men look weak. Okay, and I'm curious, how many times has Greg been accused of rape? Like, why is this like a big deal for him? You know, like, is this like a reoccurring problem in his dating life?
Greg didn't bring up the rape thing, to be fair, but that is hilarious.
Well, all of these guys then. Like, if false accusations of rape are a real problem, maybe you need to, like, think about how you're approaching women, okay? So, anyway.
Right.
If we want to talk about history with these Confederate statues, I know you say you shouldn't get in our head too much about this, but...
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, we getting rid of these statues does not get rid of history, right? We don't need to go to a courthouse and see a Confederate general sitting on a horse to, like, understand what happened in the Civil War. Like, you know,
No
walk
shit.
your kid down there and be like, oh my, yeah, look at this statue.
I had no
Got it?
idea
Okay.
what was happening until I saw the statue.
Yeah, these things don't.
Yeah, these are
blatantly
stupid
don't serve-
arguments.
They
of
don't
course.
serve a historical purpose.
No, they serve it as you would
Really,
a
actually,
propaganda
sorry,
purpose.
Sorry to butt in, Chris, but the real historical significance of these things is that they were Jim Crow era, like, celebrations of white supremacy. So
Right.
they should be kept, but as that, not some sort of historical reference to the fucking Civil War.
Yeah, like the same way we might keep, various artifacts reflecting apartheid South Africa or the Nazi regime. I mean, other great crimes against humanity.
Yeah, and they also try to say that Democrats started the KKK and they were the racists and the Confederates and stuff like that. So I'm curious why all these conservatives are going out to protect racist democratic statues that local governments, because they love local governments, these local governments are deciding to take these down. So if you don't like it, win a local election. Finally, I just want to, I know we don't want to blow this Nazi up who was crying, right? But people can look up his video if they want, and he put out his phone number. I won't do it, all right? But in the video where he's crying and going nuts, he put out his phone number so people can give him a call. I've been doing it, trying to get him to, have a little interview with me. But because of his video last night, I was really worried. He was in the Vice documentary too, saying people are going to die. I think you guys played it yesterday.
He's also visibly
so
one of the people saying Jews will not replace us.
Yeah, that dude is one of the psychopaths. Anyway, so I was up last night looking for body armor online. There are full body armor suits that you can buy. It's just cool. So if I go out to a protest, I could be Social Justice Warrior 5000 and look awesome. Another thing that people can do if they want to, and I'll just leave it here, because I know that there's a bunch of action going on this Saturday all over the country.
Right.
There is something that people can get online. It's called Crystal Violet. Now, look up the recipes for it or whatever, but all you do is you dilute it in some water, put it in a super soaker, and what it does is it finds bacteria and it dyes it. So it's like somebody trying to rob a bank and they run out and they get that dye all over them. So if you see a Nazi doing some of that stuff, you shoot them with a super soaker, being all racist and whatever, and then they have a big purple spot on their face for a month. It doesn't wash off. So use it wisely.
We
people,
cannot.
Okay? I'm just putting that out there.
Cannot advocate any of this.
Officially, we
disavow.
I disavow it. Okay, I disavow it.
Well,
okay,
well,
okay, I disavow it.
It gets the Chris Lopaco's stamp of approval. So it's nonviolent, and you're just trying to spot people who are doing things illegally, beating up black people or whatever.
Disavow, Chris. Okay, disavow, Chris.
Thanks for the contribution, but disavow.
Thank you for the contribution. Thank you for the ideas, but I disavow them.
Whatever. Bye, guys.
Bye, man. I know, everybody waits, what I'm hosting to be like, it's called the Anarchist Cookbook. Look it up. Yeah. All right, final call of the day. You're calling from an 841 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Michael, hello, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I think that Lopaca is a tactical genius. Please take his advice. But I must address Greg. Greg, you have the intellectual agility of a soap dish. Please don't bring your Bobby Fischer circular libertarian arguments to this forum anymore. You goddamn Ayn Rand snowflake.
You know what? I love it.
Okay.
It sounds a little bit more like the actual Mandela.
Okay. Hello, Michael.
Hey.
This is Greg from the North Coast. How
Hey,
you
man.
doing?
How you doing?
Hey, I've called in under various guises because it's something I've done for 35 years, living here in the decay of the Rust Belt,
Right.
and it's just something I've done in work. I taught for a while, so I use voices there. But my point today has got to be: I want to address this. The fact that there's so much money on the right that's contributing to all of this stuff.
Yep.
There's so much money on the right that enables this.
Definitely.
And back when I did community organizing, which I actually did, and lobbying, talking to guys like Tom Ridge and John Glenn, and walking in the halls of Washington trying to get people's unemployment extended, mortgage foreclosure in state houses, and children's health insurance program. Guess what we're still working on today? All of that.
Yep.
The reason I was able to be a organizer is I was funded. I could apply for grants. All right, first of all, there were grants from the union. I admit it. The various unions enabled us to get grants.
Unions
But our
have
biggest
saved
grant,
this country's democracy. Yeah, your biggest grant.
Our biggest grant came from the United States Catholic Conference. All right? So from the Catholic Church, we got our biggest grant.
Right.
And that sustained us for 4 years. I eventually had to get out of it to I had a family, and I needed to earn more money, and I also needed more, health insurance.
Right.
But we're still dealing with this. What we need are people on the left. Maybe if you sell a tequila company, or if you have enough money to invest in a basketball team, a professional basketball team, maybe you should think about taking some of that money and starting something like the Koch brothers did on the right. I mean, there's an impotency on the left to fund things anymore since the collapse of Acorn. And it's just very evident that there needs to be money on the left, a lot of money, to counteract the billions over the years, because they're using the same arguments.
Yep.
Trump sounds just like my uncle from that time. Seriously, he sounds just like him, using the same freaking arguments about the monuments, about everything. And that aggrievement politics drives so much of this, and it's fueled by the money from the Koch brothers and the Spencers and everyone else who on the right who have been brought out in the press. But if the right could expose things on the right, on the left, they would, as far as funding. All they bring up is George Soros. I mean, come on, that's all they bring
ridiculous,
up. We really need, yeah, I know it is, but we really do need people on the left.
Yeah, but I think the only problem is when ultimately, because I know that like the left is going to need to get really serious about class and inequality issues. And I actually think of anyone who even George Soros seems like the only one who has some willingness to get like, look, everybody needs to have real health care.
Oh, it takes a lot of guts, yeah.
Yeah, but and a contradiction of core self-interest, because when the Kochs or anybody else on the right, they could they could just writing off expenses to give themselves more money. And I think that basically all these other, the people on the left, like Steyer is really serious about climate change, but his vision of fighting climate change might, be totally synchronized with just kind of general centrist bullshit, which won't implicate, because ultimately real left politics implicates, like, no matter how you got it, no matter what you did, no single person should hoard that type of money. It just doesn't make sense.
It always was. The left politics has always been a reaction to that. I mean, that's what brought us unions in the 20s and the 30s. That's what the reaction of the civil rights movement was really about. Give us the ability to have some affect change and earn money, and be part of that. So, yeah, until the left figures out a way to fund it, we're going to be struggling against this organized chaos that they're trying to create. So. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you.
You really make my day when you appreciate some of those characters. I'll talk to you
love
soon.
it.
Bye.
Have a good one. All right. Thanks so much. All right, everybody. That's the last call today. I'm going to do a few IMs. Sorry, I couldn't get to everybody. Jiz Gargelet, aren't you at least a bit concerned that harping on any average governmental corruption, arguably less than in our own country in Venezuela, plays right into the hands of U.S.-backed fascists and IMF imperialists, as Ava noted, who would replace it with our own much more pernicious corruption, if not outright destruction of the gains of the revolution there? Well, the gains are already sort of completely, if you look at the numbers, poverty's spiking, crime is spiking. Those things, it does us no good, especially if we're in journalistic positions to try to position and give clear information and advocate for radical politics, to lie about Venezuela. Venezuela is becoming a ridiculous, and it's ludicrous. If you want to use Venezuela to discredit socialism, I could say 90s Russia discredits capitalism. And maybe, in fact, it does. But and I clearly noted, yes, U.S. interference from a U.S. perspective should be our prime concern. And I don't trust any of the opposition. But I'm also not going to lie. I also don't know what you mean. It might be less than what we have in the United States. But I don't think it's just average corruption. Some of that stuff is very systemic in Venezuela.
Can you read that again quick?
Aren't you at least a bit concerned that harping on
harping is just the wrong word to use there.
Yes, exactly. What good is it for the kind of reporting when it's alternative, when it's just licking its lips to total imperialist violence and destruction? I mean, honestly, if you listened to that interview and thought it was licking its lips or imperialist violence and destruction,
we have other people saying it was way too easy on Chavez.
Right. I mean, I know that I use the word delusional a lot. Maybe I'm a little quick on that one, but I would say that is a
bit sensitive,
beyond delusional response to the interview. You okay? I agree. Real progress will wait until Venezuela is safe and strong before bending over backwards to pluck the splinter out of Maduro's eyes. It only helps push Venezuela over the edge of imperialist hands. P.S. Say what you want, but Sai Baba's Nag Champa is the best. That's funny. Huge. Michael, the attempt to rewrite the cause of the Civil War has been largely debunked. Scholars point to the cornerstone speech by Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, given at the founding of the Confederacy. Turns out the cornerstone of the Confederacy is the belief that the Negro is inferior to white men and that slavery is part of the natural order.
That's in the Constitution of the Confederacy.
Yeah, so much for the states' rights bullshit, of course.
I mean, it was in ours too. But.
Yeah, I am Jimmy, exactly. I am Jimmy Sullivan. A couple of Irish guys were making a documentary about Chavez, and they were on the scene during the coup and Hugo's triumphant return. They made a surprisingly moving film about it called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, playing on YouTube. Thank you. Lefty Uno, methinks the president doth protest too much. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Definitely not. Whoa. Definitely not going to get to all these IMs. I apologize. Kelly, what's your number? The Greg guy has a point, though. You guys literally, while reading his IMs, said their issues are of race imbalance and overrepresentation of Hispanic and blacks in prison. I had to laugh off the sex imbalance of more men in prison. Kind of hit me that you literally say the same thing Greg said about race. And if someone laughed it off like you did, then we would be considered a racist who doesn't understand systemic racism. I think that might also be Greg, who I am that.
It's more about understanding where those arguments are coming from.
Yes, that's the point, is understanding where those arguments are coming from. Exactly. Courtney Cucks, progress. Can you mention that Carl Palladino was removed from the Buffalo School Board by the New York Education Commissioner? It was a legal technicality, but the outrage was really over racist emails he was sending Michelle Obama as an ape. How the fuck was that guy even there to begin with? After months of hearings and motions, it seems Charlottesville may have hastened this action. And the final... And the final IM of the day. Louise from Texas. It's like Tucker Carlson. It's like Tucker Carlson. I'm not going to read that. It's literally really stupid. I mean, it's beyond fucking belief. So now it's Black Lives Matter fault that white supremacists are just spontaneously creating groups for the first time in this country. I want to attack Tucker as the stupidest, childish, large adult son.
He's not stupid. He's sympathetic.
He's not, and deeply cynical. We will be back live tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know how far the detour takes you? Yeah, I know